This is Uncle Milo's Story Corner. I'm Uncle Milo, and this is part two of The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. We're going to pick up where we left off. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things till you couldn't rest. And you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home and said he calculated to educate him, so he never done nothing for 3 months but sit in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somerset, maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all Frog wanted was education. He could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor, Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off of the counter there, and flop down on the ground again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it comes to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywheres all said that he laid over any frog that they ever did see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp, he was, come across to him with his box and says, "What might it be that you've got in the box?" And Smiley says, sorter indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, looked at it careful, turned it round this way and that, and he says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long particular look and give it back to Smiley and says very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then says, kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." Then Smiley says, "That's all right. That's all right if you'll hold my box for a minute. I'll go and get you a frog." So the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking and thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out, prized his mouth open, and took a teaspoon, and filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog, and fetched him in, and give him to this feller, and says, "Now, if you're ready, sit alongside of Daniel, with his forepaws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "1, 2, 3, git!" And him and the feller touches up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Dan gave a heave and heisted up his shoulders, so, like a Frenchman. But it warn't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The teller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder. So, at Daniel, it says again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about that frog that's better than any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Dan a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow," and he catched Daniel by the nape of his neck and hefted him and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pound. And turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after the feller, but he never catched him, and Here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But by your leave, did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced, "Well, this year Smiley had a yaller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana. And, however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave." And that's the end of that story. The next segment is going to be how the whale got his throat from the Just So stories. That'll be the first of the Just So stories by Rudyard Kipling. So tune in for the next segment. This is Uncle Mike.